Close your eyes for just a moment and picture a mountain, not the kind you see on a screensaver, not green and gentle and tidy. A real mountain, rocky and wild, with slopes so steep that only the wind and the snow feel truly comfortable up there. The air is thin and cold. The sky is the bruised purple blue of early spring, and there is almost nothing growing except stone and frost and silence. And then, out of nowhere, pushing through a crack in the rocky soil, like it has absolutely somewhere to be and no time to waste, a single red flower opens its petals to the pale morning light. That flower is a tulip, and it has been doing exactly this, opening up stubbornly and brilliantly in some of the most inhospitable terrain on Earth for approximately 23 million years. Welcome back. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're already settled in with your pillow and your blanket and your glass of water that you'll definitely drink later, tell me where you are in the comments and what time it is where you are. I love knowing that someone in New Zealand and someone in Norway and someone in Ohio are all settling in together at completely different hours of the same night. Now is the time to dim the lights and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Tonight we're following a flower, not just any flower, a flower that started its life on the windswept slopes of Central Asia, made its way along ancient trade routes to the perfumed gardens of sultans, caused what historians now consider the world's first financial bubble, and somehow ended up being voted the most quintessentially Dutch thing in existence, despite having absolutely nothing to do with the Netherlands for the first 22.5 million years of its life. The tulip story is honestly one of the most dramatic and entertaining chapters in the entire history of plants. And if you're thinking, wait, is this going to be a video about plants? I want you to know that by the end of tonight, you will have encountered obsessive Ottoman sultans, a diplomat who may have accidentally named the wrong thing, a botanist whose prized flowers were stolen out of his garden in the middle of the night, a disease that masqueraded as beauty, and a moment in 1637 when a single flower bulb sold for more money than a Grand Canal house in Amsterdam. We're talking speculation, intrigue, desire, and about 50,000 bulbs being carted across mountains on the backs of horses and camels, all because somebody fell completely and helplessly in love with a flower. Let's start at the very beginning, which is, as beginnings go, a genuinely ancient one. The tulip's closest botanical ancestors have been traced back to Central Asia, specifically to a broad, dramatic sweep of mountainous terrain that runs across what is today Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and the mountain ranges on either side. The Tian Shan Range, the Pamir Mountains, places where the altitude is punishing, the winters are brutal, and the summers arrive hot and dry and sudden. In other words, pretty miserable conditions for most living things. The tulip, however, took one look at all that and said, yes, actually, this is exactly my kind of neighborhood. Wild tulips are extraordinary survivors. Scientists who have studied tulip genetics have found that the most recent common ancestor of all wild tulip species lived in Central Asia, roughly 23 million years ago, and that over the millennia, the explosion of different tulip species across the region was driven by a combination of things. The steady aridification of the landscape, the rising of enormous mountain ranges, and global cooling events that would have wiped out less adaptable plants entirely. The tulip just kept evolving, kept diversifying, kept pushing up through the frost in new and slightly different forms. Today, there are around 120 known wild tulip species, and nearly half of them are native to that Central Asian region. They come in reds and yellows and oranges and whites. Their petals are often pointed, almost like stars, and the blooms sit close to the ground. Nothing like the tall, cup-shaped tulips you'll see at a garden center in April. Wild tulips are smaller, spikier, more modest. But in the right light, coming up through a rocky hillside after a long gray winter, they are absolutely stunning. For the nomadic peoples who moved through these landscapes for thousands of years, following herds, following seasons, following trade routes that connected Central Asia to the Persian world and beyond. The arrival of the first tulips each spring was a significant event. Not just pleasant, but meaningful. The tulip was a sign. It meant the worst of winter was behind you. It meant the earth was alive again. It meant you and your animals had made it through another season. Historians still argue whether the tulip held formal, spiritual significance for these early Central Asian cultures, or whether its importance was primarily practical, a marker of spring, nothing more. But what we do know is that the flower was noticed and remembered and followed as it gradually moved westward, because that is what the tulip did over thousands of years. It moved. Following trade routes, carried accidentally or deliberately by merchants and soldiers and curious travelers, tulip seeds and bulbs made their slow way from the mountains of Central Asia toward Persia, toward Anatolia, and eventually toward the world beyond. Persia, modern-day Iran, is where the tulip first becomes a character in recorded human culture rather than just a wildflower on a hillside. By the 10th century, Persian poets were writing about it. Not incidentally, not as background scenery, but with the kind of focused, passionate attention that poets usually reserve for the things they love most deeply. The red tulip in Persian poetry and symbolism was the color of burning love. Its dark center, that inky black starburst at the base of the petals, was said to represent the heart of the lover, burnt to ash by the intensity of longing. It's a dramatic metaphor, frankly, but then Persian poetry has always had strong feelings and absolutely no interest in understatement. The word in Persian is lala, red, passionate, sacred. And tulips had been cultivated in Persian gardens since at least the 10th century, which means that by the time Europe was still puzzling over which century it was in and arguing about whose feudal lord owed whose feudal lord what, there were already Persian garden designers carefully selecting and cultivating and arranging tulip varieties in formal gardens of considerable sophistication. The Persians understood very early that tulips were interesting in a way that went beyond mere prettiness. They hybridized. They mutated, they surprised you. Plant a tulip bulb in autumn and come back in spring, and you might get the same solid red flower you expected, or you might get something slightly different, streaked or differently shaped, or a shade you didn't anticipate. This unpredictability made the flower feel almost alive in a particular way, as if it had its own ideas. The tulip's journey from Persia into what would become the Ottoman Empire is a story told partly through genetics and partly through the migration of the Seljuk Turks, who swept westward out of Central Asia in the 11th century, conquering most of Anatolia and northern Persia, and bringing with them the cultural traditions of their Central Asian homeland, including, crucially, their familiarity with tulips. The tulip tradition likely traveled with these Seljuk migrations from Central Asia to Anatolia, where it would gradually become woven into the fabric of Ottoman culture. By the 14th century, wild tulips were being collected from their natural habitats and introduced deliberately into Ottoman palace gardens. This is a significant moment because it marks the shift from the tulip as a thing found in nature to the tulip as a thing cultivated, controlled, shaped by human hands and human desire. Ottoman gardeners were not simply transplanting wildflowers and hoping for the best. They were selecting, experimenting, hybridizing. They were thinking about which qualities to encourage, which varieties to propagate. They were, in other words, doing something that would not have looked entirely out of place in a modern horticultural laboratory, except that it was happening in garden pavilions, decorated with tiles and fountains, with the smell of jasmine in the air and the sound of the Bosphorus in the distance. The Ottoman relationship with flowers generally was deeply serious and deeply aesthetic. Gardens were not decorative afterthoughts. They were central to imperial culture, to philosophy, to the expression of power and refinement. An Ottoman palace without magnificent gardens was almost unthinkable. And among all the flowers that filled those gardens, roses, hyacinths, carnations, irises, the tulip gradually rose to a position of particular eminence. There is a word in Arabic numerology, abjad, a system in which letters carry numerical values. And in this system, the word lale, the Turkish word for tulip, carries exactly the same numerical value as the word Allah. To the Ottoman court, this was not a coincidence, it was a sign. The tulip was the flower of God, literally. And when you write lale in Arabic script, the letters are the same letters used in writing Allah. When people say the tulip was sacred in the Ottoman world, they are not speaking loosely or metaphorically. The flower was understood to carry divine significance, encoded in its very name. This gave the tulip a spiritual dimension that no other flower in the Ottoman world quite possessed. You'd find tulip motifs on mosque tiles, on prayer rugs, embroidered into garments, worked into the ceilings of palace rooms. Not as decoration alone, but as invocation, as reminder, as a kind of continuous quiet prayer pressed into the surfaces of everyday life. On battle shirts, tulips were embroidered as protective talismans. In one extraordinary example housed today in Istanbul's Museum of Turkish and Islamic Arts, a garment belonging to a royal son, bears Quranic verses on its front and embroidered tulips on its back. Spiritual armor on one side, divine beauty on the other. And the tulip also, when it bows its head in full bloom, as tulips do, the heavy flower, nodding slightly on its stem, was said to represent humility before God, a flower so beautiful it could not help but bow. You have to admit that is a rather magnificent interpretation of what is, botanically speaking, just the flower getting a bit heavy. Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent came to the Ottoman throne in 1520. And if you had to pick one person in history whose relationship to tulips was genuinely, deeply, impressively unhinged in the most charming way, it might be him. Suleiman adored tulips. His robes and cloaks were heavily embroidered with tulip motifs. He charged his subjects, as part of their formal obligations to the palace, with supplying large quantities of tulips as a kind of floral tribute. His private garden, known as the Abode of Bliss, was a carefully managed sanctuary, filled with tulips selected for their quality and rarity, tended by professional gardeners who spoke their own specialized dialect and whose entire purpose in life was to keep this garden in a state of perfection. Under Suleiman, the cultivated Istanbul tulip began to develop its own distinctive character, different from its wild Central Asian ancestor in ways that the Ottoman court found deeply pleasing. Wild tulips are small and starry and close to the ground. The Istanbul tulip, as it emerged through selective cultivation, was tall, elegant, with elongated petals that came to a precise point, almost like a needle. Slender, architectural. The kind of flower that, if flowers could be aristocratic, would clearly be aristocratic. Gardeners devoted themselves to this aesthetic vision with extraordinary specificity. The petals had to be perfectly smooth, perfectly symmetrical, the color pure and unbroken, the stem upright and strong. Any deviation from this ideal was considered a defect. Records from the reign of Mehmed IV, just over a century after Suleiman, show that the named varieties of cultivated tulips in Ottoman Istanbul had grown into the hundreds. And the names given to these varieties are themselves a kind of poetry: light of paradise, matchless pearl, diamond's envy, rose of the dawn, pomegranate lance. Each name conjuring not just a color or a shape, but a feeling, an aspiration, a place in an imagined hierarchy of beauty. Historians still argue whether the Ottoman tulip growers were following a formal aesthetic code or whether the naming conventions evolved more organically through the community of growers and enthusiasts who gathered around the palace gardens. Either way, the effect is the same. The tulip had become not just a flower, but a language. There is also a fascinating quirk in this period that is worth dwelling on for a moment. Sultan Selim II, Suleiman's son, is on record as having ordered 50,000 tulip bulbs for his palace gardens from a single source. Some accounts mention figures as high as 300,000 bulbs in various orders from across the empire's territory. When you imagine 50,000 tulip bulbs being collected, transported, cataloged, and planted, each one handled individually, each one representing a specific variety that the Sultan had decided he required. You start to get a sense of the scale of the Ottoman imperial horticultural enterprise. This was not a hobby. This was a state project. The logistics of supplying the palace with its required flowers involved networks of growers, collectors, traders, and administrators stretching across the empire's territory. The tulip, in other words, was already a commodity of consequence long before it ever crossed a European border. The infrastructure of desire that would later, in a different country, lead to economic mania and financial ruin. That infrastructure was already being built, in a quieter way, in the gardens of Ottoman Istanbul. And while all of this was happening behind palace walls and in the lush gardens of the Ottoman elite, a very curious thing was taking place on the road between two cities. A diplomat from the Flemish-speaking lowlands of Europe was riding on horseback through the Ottoman landscape in 1554, on his way from one city to another, when he spotted something in a field that he had absolutely never seen before in his life. His name was Ogier Ghiselin de Busbecq, and the fact that he paused to look at that flower and wrote about it in the letters he was sending home to a friend is arguably the moment that changed the tulip's entire destiny. Ogier Ghiselin de Busbecq was, by most accounts, one of the most observant and intellectually curious diplomats of the 16th century. Born in 1522 in Flanders, what is now the border region between Belgium and France, he was the illegitimate son of a local nobleman, educated at the finest universities in Europe, and eventually recruited into the service of the Habsburg ruler Ferdinand I as a diplomat. In 1554, he was dispatched to Constantinople, the great capital of the Ottoman Empire, to negotiate a border dispute over Transylvania. It was a mission that would keep him in the Ottoman world for nearly 8 years. And during that time, he wrote letters home that described what he was seeing with such detail and vitality that they were eventually published and read widely across Europe. On his journey toward Constantinople in the spring of 1554, riding on horseback through the Ottoman landscape near Adrianople, which is today the Turkish city of Edirne, Busbecq passed through countryside filled with a flower he had never encountered. The flower was vivid, scarlet, alive with color. He stopped to look. He asked his guides what the flower was called, and his guide, interpreting the question as an invitation to explain the flower to this foreign visitor, pointed to the turban-like shape of the bloom and used a word, tulbent, which in Ottoman Turkish meant turban. And here's the thing. Busbecq almost certainly misunderstood. The flower's actual name in Turkish was Lele. The guide was almost certainly describing the shape, drawing a comparison, saying something to the effect of, "Look at how it looks like a turban." But Busbecq, new to the language, heard the word for turban and wrote it down as the name of the flower. The result? Traveling back through his letters, through the scholars and botanists who read those letters, through the gradual spread of the flower's name across European languages, is the word we still use today, tulip, derived from tulbend, turban. So the name we call this flower by in English and French and German and a dozen other languages is essentially a 470-year-old translation error. The Turks to this day call it lale. We call it tulip because a diplomat saw a flower and a guide pointed at a turban, and somehow everybody just went with it. Busbecq was enchanted. He described the tulips he saw with enthusiasm in his letters, remarking on their beauty and the abundance with which they appeared across the countryside. He visited the imperial gardens in Constantinople and observed tulips growing there with the kind of care and intentionality that made clear to him these were not just any flowers. He was a man who noticed things, and he noticed that the Ottomans had a relationship with this flower that went well beyond casual appreciation. When Busbecq eventually prepared to leave Constantinople and return westward, he took tulip bulbs with him. The exact number and circumstances are not entirely clear from historical records. Some accounts suggest he sent bulbs ahead to a botanist friend in Vienna, others that he carried them himself. But the broad outline is well established. In 1554 and in the years following, tulip bulbs and seeds from the Ottoman Empire arrived in Vienna, where they were planted in the imperial gardens under the supervision of the Habsburg court. From Vienna they traveled to Augsburg, to Antwerp, to other cities along the networks of scholars and botanists who were in this period of European intellectual ferment, frantically exchanging plants, seeds, and specimens, the way a later generation would exchange ideas or eventually money. The tulip arrived in Europe as an exotic curiosity from the sophisticated East, and in the 16th century, the Ottoman Empire's sophistication relative to Western Europe was not in doubt. Europeans knew they were encountering something that came from a culture of considerable refinement, and the tulip carried that origin story with it like a kind of invisible prestige. This was not a weed from a hedgerow. This was a flower from the gardens of the sublime Porte. The man who changed the tulip's fate in Europe more than anyone else was a Flemish botanist named Carolus Clusius, known to his friends presumably by his French name Charles de Lecluse, though nobody in the history book seems to use it. Clusius was born in 1526 in Arras, France, trained in medicine and law and botany across multiple European universities, and developed over the course of his long career into one of the most important botanists of the Renaissance. He was the kind of person whose enthusiasm for plants was so enormous and so contagious that he built up a network of over 300 correspondents across Europe, all of whom were sending him seeds, bulbs, observations, sketches, and samples of whatever interesting plant life they had come across. He was, in 16th century terms, the most connected plant person in the world. Clusius had almost certainly seen tulips for the first time sometime in the 1560s in the garden of a Flemish businessman with horticultural interests. He was intrigued. He began acquiring bulbs through his networks. He studied them. He grew them in successive positions, in gardens in Frankfurt, in Vienna, where he had been invited to establish a botanical garden for the Emperor Maximilian II, and eventually in a series of private gardens as he moved around Europe following patronage and opportunity. In 1593, when Clusius was already in his late 60s, an invitation arrived that would change everything. The newly established University of Leiden in the Dutch Republic offered him a position as a professor of botany and the opportunity to develop a botanical garden on the university's grounds. Clusius accepted. he packed up his life, which at this point included a collection of tulip bulbs that was by any measure the finest and most comprehensive in the Western world, and moved to Leiden. The University of Leiden's botanical garden, the Hortus Botanicus, still exists today. It is one of the oldest botanical gardens in Europe. And when you visit, you can stand in roughly the spot where, in 1593 and 1594, Carolus Clusius planted his tulip bulbs in Dutch soil for the first time. In 1594, those bulbs bloomed. It was the first recorded flowering of tulips in the Netherlands. Clusius observed his tulips, carefully noted their characteristics, began hybridizing them, and began sharing specimens with the correspondents and fellow scholars who formed his extensive network. He also noticed something peculiar. Some of his tulips, previously solid single-colored blooms, began without any obvious cause to produce flowers with dramatic streaks and flames of contrasting color running through the petals. A plain red tulip would suddenly put up a bloom that was red and white in intricate, feathery patterns. A yellow tulip would show purple flames. The effect was extraordinary, like a painter had taken a fine brush and added something extravagant and unpredictable to what had been a plain canvas. Clusius looked at these broken, flamed, feathered tulips and had an inkling that something was wrong with them. They were smaller, slightly weaker, harder to propagate. He suspected disease. But nobody, including Clusius, one of the finest botanical minds of his generation, had any framework for understanding what a virus was. That concept would not exist for another 3 centuries. So the observation was noted, the suspicion filed away. And in the meantime, the Dutch public got one look at these impossibly beautiful, randomly patterned flowers and decided they were the most magnificent things they had ever seen. The problem with Clusius's tulip collection, as far as he was concerned, was that he priced it appropriately for its rarity and refused to sell at the prices people wanted to pay. He was, accounts suggest, stubborn about this. The Dutch public, increasingly obsessed, took matters into their own hands. Between 1596 and 1598, over 100 bulbs were stolen from Clusius's garden. Stolen. In the night. By people who could not bear to wait any longer. Historians still argue whether these thefts were opportunistic or coordinated, but what is clear is that the stolen bulbs were propagated, hybridized, spread, and formed the foundation of what would become the Dutch tulip industry. So the Dutch tulip trade, the thing that would eventually produce Tulip Mania and Fields of Flowers and Keukenhof and all the rest of it, was launched in part by a horticultural crime spree. A botanist's garden was robbed, and the world changed. By the early 17th century, the tulip had become something it had never quite been before in its 23 million year history. Fashionable. Not just appreciated, not just cultivated, but fashionable. And fashionable in a specific early modern European way that meant wealthy people had to have one, and having a particularly good one was a mark of status. And the scarcity of good ones meant that the ones that existed became increasingly, absurdly, almost cosmically expensive. The context matters here. The Dutch Republic in the early 17th century was in the middle of what historians call the Dutch Golden Age, one of the most remarkable episodes of economic and cultural flowering in European history. Amsterdam had become one of the wealthiest cities in the world. Dutch merchants were at the center of global trade, operating through the Dutch East India Company and the Dutch West India Company, running routes that brought spices and silks and gold from Asia and the Americas into Dutch warehouses and Dutch hands. The returns were extraordinary. A single successful voyage to the East Indies could yield profits of 400%. There was money everywhere, looking for somewhere to go. Into this environment of surplus capital and conspicuous consumption and a culture that celebrated wealth and beauty equally, the tulip arrived like something perfectly designed to absorb all available human excitement. It was rare. It was beautiful. It was foreign and exotic. It was variable in ways that made each individual bulb potentially unique. And it was alive. You couldn't manufacture more of the best varieties quickly because bulbs reproduced slowly, and the most spectacular ones reproduced even more slowly because of the virus weakening them. The trade in tulip bulbs began informally through networks of enthusiasts, wealthy merchants and aristocrats and scholars who swapped bulbs and seeds the way collectors have always swapped rarities. But as prices climbed, the market became more formal and eventually more dangerous. By the 1630s, tulip bulbs were being traded not just at point of delivery, but as future contracts, agreements to purchase a bulb that hadn't been dug yet, for a price agreed upon now. This was functionally a futures market, a financial instrument, and it was being operated largely out of taverns where buyers and sellers would gather, record their agreements in the tavern's ledger book, and walk away having exchanged enormous sums of money for flowers that were currently underground. The varieties that commanded the highest prices were the broken tulips, those infected with the tulip breaking virus, though nobody knew that yet, with their dramatic flames and feathers of contrasting color. They had categories and names: rosen, white streaks on red or pink; violetten, white on purple; bizarden, the rarest of all, with yellow or white streaks on red, brown, or purple. And above all these, certain individual named varieties that had achieved a kind of celebrity status, the flower world equivalent of a vintage wine from a legendary year. The most famous of all, the Semper Augustus, white petals with brilliant red flames streaking upward like fire. Fewer than a dozen bulbs of this variety existed in the world at the height of the mania. In 1624, a single Semper Augustus bulb was valued at 1,000 guilders. That was already eye-watering. By 1637, the price of a single Semper Augustus bulb had reached 10,000 guilders. 10,000. To put that in context, 10,000 guilders was, as one historian wrote, sufficient to purchase one of the grandest homes on the most fashionable canal in Amsterdam, complete with a carriage house and an 80-foot garden. A single flower bulb, the size of a large onion, worth a canal house. And lest you think only the Semper Augustus had lost all contact with rational valuation, a single viceroy bulb, another prized variety, changed hands for between 3,000 and 4,000 florins. Records survive of an exchange in which someone traded a bed, a complete suit of clothes, and 1,000 pounds of cheese for a single tulip bulb. You read that correctly. Cheese was involved. At the height of the mania in late 1636 and early 1637, contracts for tulip bulbs were reportedly changing hands 5 times in a single day, with prices increasing 20-fold in a single month. You probably won't survive this next fact, but here it is anyway. The world's first recorded financial bubble, and it was about flowers. The crash, when it came, was swift and total. On a February morning in 1637, some accounts say it was at a flower auction in the city of Haarlem, an auctioneer put up a lot of tulip bulbs and found no buyers. He lowered the price. Still no buyers. Lowered it again. Nothing. The buyers who had been paying astronomical sums for bulbs just days before were gone. Vanished. Word spread quickly, as bad news always does, and within days, the market for tulip contracts had collapsed almost entirely. People who had signed contracts to purchase bulbs at peak prices found themselves holding legally questionable pieces of paper promising vast sums of money for something that was now worth a tiny fraction of that. People who had sold their possessions to invest found themselves with nothing. The Dutch government was flooded with petitions from desperate traders trying to have their contracts voided. The courts, in a response that has a certain satisfying logic to it, ruled that debts contracted through gambling were not legally enforceable. And since speculating on the price of flower bulbs was, they felt, essentially gambling, the courts declined to enforce the contracts. Some people lost everything. Some people who had been careful or lucky or simply not caught up in the final madness came through more or less unscathed. Historians have debated for years whether Tulip Mania caused a serious economic depression in the Netherlands, or whether the actual economic damage, as opposed to the psychological and social damage, was more limited than the famous accounts suggest. Charles Mackay, who wrote about Tulip Mania in his 1841 book, Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds, painted an apocalyptic picture of an entire nation ruined by flowers. Modern economic historians have suggested the reality was more nuanced, with the losses concentrated among those directly involved in the tulip trade, rather than spreading throughout the economy. Historians still argue whether the 1637 collapse represented a true economic catastrophe or more of a contained speculative episode. But what everyone agrees on is that it was weird, it was dramatic, and it has been impossible to stop talking about ever since. There is a famous story, probably apocryphal, but too perfect not to mention, of a visiting sailor in Amsterdam who, lodging in a wealthy merchant's home, came across what he assumed was an onion on a sideboard. Feeling peckish before breakfast, he ate it. It was, of course, a Semper Augustus tulip bulb worth thousands of guilders. The merchant, returning to find his fortune, had been consumed as a breakfast snack, reportedly had the sailor arrested. Whether this story is true or embellished beyond recognition is not entirely clear, but it captures something real about the era. That these small, brown lumps of plant material had been elevated to such absurd value that ordinary, sensory experience couldn't reconcile what they looked like with what they were supposed to be worth. Meanwhile, the tulip bulb trade that survived the crash, and it did survive, stripped of its most speculative elements, became the foundation of an actual horticultural industry in the Netherlands. The region around Leiden and Haarlem, with its sandy, well-drained soil that turned out to be almost perfectly suited to tulip cultivation, gradually became the center of commercial flower bulb production. Growers who had survived the mania and learned hard lessons about what happens when speculation overtakes genuine cultivation turned their attention to doing the work properly. New varieties were bred. Methods for selecting and propagating the best bulbs were refined. The trade in tulip bulbs became less like gambling and more like farming, which it always should have been, arguably, but which is considerably less exciting as a story. The Dutch tulip industry that emerged from the ruins of Tulip Mania is the direct ancestor of the industry that today produces around 2 billion cut tulips annually, supplying nearly 80% of the world's tulip market. The field after field of color that you see in photographs of the Netherlands in spring, the Bollen streak, the bulb region, with tulips stretching to the horizon in every possible shade. That is the long, quiet, industrious sequel to one of history's most spectacular financial disasters. Let's go back to the Ottoman world for a moment, because the tulip's story there was developing on its own extraordinary trajectory, and it eventually produced something that in its own way was just as dramatic as Tulip Mania. It was just wrapped in a great deal more silk and considerably more poetry. By the time the Dutch were nursing their post-mania financial hangovers in the late 1630s, the Ottoman Empire was continuing its deep, serious, culturally embedded love affair with the tulip that had been developing for centuries. The Ottoman tulip was different from the Dutch tulip. It wasn't about speculation or futures contracts or tavern-based trading. It was about aesthetics, about spiritual meaning, about the display of power through beauty. Ottoman tulip growers were not trying to get rich. They were trying to get perfect. Sultan Mehmed IV, who reigned from 1648 to 1687, oversaw a period during which the names of cultivated tulip varieties proliferated dramatically. Records suggest that by the late 17th century, there were more than 1,500 named varieties of tulip in cultivation in Istanbul. 1,500. Each one named, cataloged, evaluated against strict aesthetic criteria that had been developing for over a century. The ideal Istanbul tulip remained that slender, tall, needle-petaled flower, not the round cup-shaped varieties that the Dutch preferred, but something more like a six-pointed star on a long stem, each petal coming to a perfectly symmetrical point. Gardeners who produced varieties that came closest to this ideal received recognition, prizes, the kind of professional prestige that comes from being very, very good at something that other people also care about very much. Some of the tulip varieties of this period were bred by women. This is noted in historical records with a casualness that is actually rather striking. Several varieties, with names like Gem of the Shah and Seeker of Hearts, are credited to accomplished women growers who worked within the palace or noble household networks. In a culture where women's contributions to intellectual and artistic life were often not recorded or credited, the naming of tulip varieties after or by their cultivators preserved these women's work in the historical record. Then came the period that the Turks themselves would eventually name the Lale Devri, the tulip era. And it is honestly one of the most peculiar and glittering and ultimately tragic episodes in Ottoman history, and it lasted for exactly 12 years. Sultan Ahmed III came to the throne in 1703. He reigned through a period of considerable difficulty, wars, defeats, political turbulence, before arriving in 1718 at a moment of relative peace following the Treaty of Passarowitz. He was by this point a man who had seen enough of war and who had a serious interest in beauty and culture and the pleasures of an aesthetically refined life. His son-in-law, whom he appointed as Grand Vizier, was a man named Nevşehirli Damat Ibrahim Pasha, intelligent, culturally curious, and deeply fond of tulips. Together, the two men created something that was part cultural renaissance, part pleasure garden, part diplomatic experiment, and part, as things turned out, a catastrophic miscalculation about how much luxury the Ottoman public was prepared to tolerate from their ruling class. The tulip era, Lale Devri, ran from 1718 to 1730, and during those 12 years, Constantinople became arguably the most tulip-obsessed city on earth. The Grand Vizier Ibrahim Pasha was himself a passionate collector and cultivator of tulip bulbs. He set an example that Istanbul's elite followed eagerly, competing to accumulate the rarest varieties, to host the most spectacular tulip displays, to be seen as the most refined and discerning appreciator of floral beauty. The tulip parties of this era are one of the more extraordinary things you can read about in Ottoman history. Ahmed III's palace gardens were famous for their nighttime tulip festivals. Evenings in spring, when tens of thousands of tulips would be in bloom simultaneously, and the gardens would be illuminated with thousands of oil lamps and candles placed among the flowers. Imagine it, a warm spring night, the air heavy with the scent of flowers, and an entire garden glowing with soft light, every tulip petal catching the flame and sending it back in red and white and yellow and purple. Tortoises moved through the gardens carrying candles on their shells. Yes, really, creating slowly moving points of light among the rows of flowers. Caged birds sang. Poets recited. Music played from open-air kiosks, where the empire's elite reclined on silk cushions and competed in a friendly way to compose the most eloquent verse, comparing the tulip to the cheek of a beloved. The tulip in this period defined nobility and privilege in ways that went beyond mere decoration. Tulip bulbs were traded at increasingly high prices. Sultan Ahmed's own gardens were stocked with the finest tulips that could be obtained from both the empire's domestic growers, including bulbs cultivated on Turkey's high mountain pastures, and from Holland's commercial growers, because by this point the Dutch tulip industry was producing varieties that even the Ottomans found worth acquiring. Historians still argue whether this represents an irony, a paradox, or simply the way of the world. The flower had traveled from Central Asia to Turkey to the Netherlands, been transformed by Dutch growers into new commercial varieties, and now some of those Dutch varieties were finding their way back to the place that had first given the tulip its cultural significance. The Grand Admiral of the fleet, Mustafa Pasha, is recorded in this period as having established 44 new tulip breeds. 44. While also presumably running an entire navy. The tulip era also produced, alongside all the horticulture, a genuine cultural flowering. Art, architecture, music, and poetry all flourished under the patronage of Ahmed and Ibrahim Pasha. The miniature painter Abdul Jalil Levni produced extraordinary work that depicted the court and its pleasures with a freshness and individuality that set him apart from his predecessors. The poet Nadim wrote verses that captured the mood of this pleasure-loving court, sensuous, refined, tinged with the awareness that pleasure is always temporary. The first Ottoman language printing press was established in 1727, producing books on history and geography for a reading public that was, for the first time, allowed to access printed knowledge in their own language. Buildings went up, gardens were designed. A new summer palace, the Sadabad, was constructed along a canal designed to evoke the gardens of Versailles, which an Ottoman ambassador had visited in Paris, and described in such enthusiastic detail that Ahmed and his Grand Vizier decided they needed something similar on the banks of the Golden Horn. All of this cost money, a great deal of money, and the people of Istanbul, not the elite, not the courtiers who attended the tulip parties and received their salaries from the imperial treasury, but ordinary people, laborers and craftsmen and soldiers, were watching all of this luxury with growing unease. The tulip era ended on the 28th of September 1730 with a rebellion. It was not a slow building political movement. It was swift, violent, and final. The leader was a man named Patrona Halil, an Albanian-born former sailor who had become a bathhouse attendant and then a janissary. He gathered around him a group of men who were furious about the excesses of the court, about the money being spent on gardens and parties, while the empire was losing wars and ordinary people were struggling. Patrona Halil's mob laid siege to Topkapi Palace. Sultan Ahmed III, faced with the choice between sacrificing his beloved son-in-law and Grand Vizier or facing the full fury of the rebellion, chose to sacrifice Ibrahim Pasha. The Grand Vizier, the man who had done more than anyone else to create the tulip era, was handed over to the rebels and executed. Ahmed himself was forced to abdicate. He lived out the remaining years of his life under house arrest, confined in the palace he had once filled with flowers and music, dying in 1736. The tulip parties were over. The Sadabad Palace was eventually demolished. The tulip era passed into history, though not into forgetting. The Turks have never forgotten it, and in retrospect, with the distance of centuries, many historians look at it as a moment of genuine cultural brilliance, cut short not by its own failures, but by the political economy of popular resentment. The tulip remained in Ottoman culture, of course. It could not be uninvented, could not be stripped of its symbolism. It continued to appear on mosque tiles, on textiles, in poetry. It remained a national symbol. Today, Istanbul hosts an annual tulip festival every April, in which millions of tulips bloom across the city's parks and roundabouts and public squares. 30 million tulips. In some years, in hundreds of varieties. The city that the tulip made its own centuries ago still turns itself over to the flower every spring. And the connection between Istanbul and the tulip is as deep and genuine now as it was in the days of Suleiman or Ahmed III. The tulip shape is incorporated into the emblem of the Turkish police. It appears on logos and textiles and souvenirs. The word Lale is a common and beloved girl's name. When Busbek rode through Edirne in 1554 and saw those red flowers blooming in a field, he was looking at something that had already been woven into this culture for centuries and that would remain woven into it for centuries more. Meanwhile, back in the Netherlands, the tulip was following its own quieter, more industrious trajectory, transforming from speculative instrument to agricultural product, from status symbol to genuine cultural icon in a way that was slower and more permanent than Tulip Mania had been, but no less complete. Let's talk about the virus. Because no story about tulips can be complete without the virus. And it is, when you learn the full picture, one of the stranger intersections of beauty and disease that history has to offer. The flowers that drove Tulip Mania to its most insane heights. The Semper Augustus with its white petals and red flames. The Viceroy with its intricate streaking, all the broken and feathered and flamed varieties that commanded impossible prices, were, every single one of them, sick. Not metaphorically sick in the way that a society obsessively paying canal house prices for onion-shaped lumps is sick. Actually, biologically sick. Infected with a virus that was destroying the pigmentation cells in their petals in beautiful, unpredictable patterns that humans found irresistible. The virus responsible is called the tulip-breaking virus, and it is transmitted by aphids, small sap-sucking insects that move from plant to plant and carry the virus with them as they feed. When an aphid feeds on an infected tulip and then moves to a healthy one, the healthy tulip gets infected too. The virus disrupts the production of anthocyanins, the pigments responsible for the deep reds and purples in tulip petals, in specific patterns that vary depending on the variety of tulip and the strain of the virus. The result is those extraordinary streaks and flames and feathers. The mathematical pattern of the disruption is genuinely beautiful. Scientists published a paper in 2025 describing a mathematical model that finally explains exactly how the virus creates the stripe patterns, which is delightful because it means the mystery of tulip stripes was only fully understood about 390 years after people first started spending fortunes on them. Clusius had noticed that the broken tulips were weaker, smaller, less likely to reproduce. He had suspected something was wrong. But in the 16th century, the concept of a plant virus didn't exist. In fact, the first plant virus, tobacco mosaic virus, wasn't discovered until 1892, and the tulip breaking virus specifically wasn't identified until 1928. For almost 3 centuries, people traded these infected flowers as the rarest and most desirable of all varieties, not knowing they were buying beautiful, dying things. There's a painful irony here that the Dutch Golden Age would have recognized and appreciated. The most valuable tulips were the ones that were already dying. Their beauty was a symptom of their illness. The disease was the art, and the people paying canal house prices for them were, in a very literal sense, investing in something that could not sustain itself. The bulbs were weakened by the virus, reproducing more slowly and less reliably than healthy ones, which made them scarcer, which made them more expensive, which made more people want them, which was a perfect closed loop of desire and ruin. Once the virus's role was understood in the early 20th century, commercial tulip growers knew they had to eradicate it. Infected bulbs could no longer be sold as desirable rarities. They had to be treated as disease stock to be destroyed or isolated. The gorgeous Semper Augustus and all its kin, the Viceroy, the Bizerden varieties, the entire category of broken tulips that had once been worth more than houses, disappeared from commercial cultivation. They exist now only in paintings. In the extraordinary Dutch Golden Age, still life portraits that captured their beauty. Ambrosius Boschart, the elder's 1614 masterpiece, showing cut flowers in a glass vase, featuring both the Viceroy and the Semper Augustus alongside other blooms. They are frozen forever, brilliant and doomed. The virus does live on in a few modern cultivars, certain parrot tulips, the Rembrandt varieties, the bizarre and bijbloemen types that are deliberately maintained as infected strains in controlled conditions. But the wild, unpredictable breaking that made Tulip Mania possible, the lottery element of never knowing quite what your bulb would produce, is gone. Modern, broken-looking tulips are bred, not diseased. Their patterns are controlled, predictable, reproducible. The magic is managed, which is, depending on how you look at it, either a great improvement or a loss of something irreplaceable. The Dutch tulip industry that emerged from Tulip Mania's wreckage, and which has now been operating continuously for roughly 4 centuries, is one of the most extraordinary agricultural enterprises in human history. And the fact that it exists at all, that the Netherlands became and remained the global capital of tulip production, is partly geography and partly stubbornness, and partly the fact that Dutch agricultural engineering has always been, to put it plainly, incredible. The soil in the region around Leiden and Haarlem, the Bollenstreek, the bulb region, is a narrow strip of sandy, well-drained soil between the coastal dunes and the clay polders behind them. Sandy soil drains quickly, which means tulip bulbs don't sit in wet ground through winter the way they would in heavier soils, which means they don't rot, which means they thrive. The Dutch, who had been engineering their landscape for centuries, building dikes, draining lakes, reclaiming land from the sea, recognized what they had and developed it methodically. The industry that grew up from Harlem outward over the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries became increasingly sophisticated. New varieties were bred and selected. The process of hybridization, which the Ottoman gardeners had practiced intuitively for centuries, was refined into a more systematic science, and the Dutch developed a particular genius for the commercial side of the business, for marketing, for distribution, for understanding what buyers across Europe wanted and producing it at scale. The Dutch horticultural auction, the famous clock auction, where buyers indicate their price as a displayed price, counts down rather than up, and the first buyer to stop the clock wins the contract, became the standard method for selling cut flowers and bulbs in the Netherlands. These auctions, which still operate today and handle billions of flowers annually, are the direct institutional descendants of the 17th century tulip market. The infrastructure of desire, built and broken in 1637, was rebuilt more carefully and is still running. Today, the Netherlands produces approximately 3 billion tulip bulbs per year. 3 billion. That is enough bulbs, if you stacked them, to make a tower reaching roughly halfway to the moon, which is not a practical thing, but is the kind of number that deserves a moment of quiet acknowledgement. Most of those bulbs are exported to gardeners, to commercial flower growers, to garden centers, to the wholesale markets that supply florists in cities across the world. The Netherlands supplies approximately 70 to 80% of all the tulip bulbs produced commercially on Earth, and the Keukenhof, the Garden of Europe as it is known, is the global showcase of what 4 centuries of tulip cultivation has produced. Opened as a flower exhibition in 1949 on the grounds of a historic estate near Lisse, between Leiden and Haarlem, it operates for just a few weeks each spring when the tulip fields are in bloom. During those weeks, millions of people visit from around the world. There are 7 million tulip bulbs planted in the Keukenhof's 32 hectares each year. 7 million individual bulbs, representing hundreds of named varieties, arranged in gardens of extraordinary complexity and beauty. The tulip names have changed since the Ottoman era. There are still romantic ones: Queen of the Night, a deep purple-black variety of considerable beauty; Ballerina, a lily-flowering tulip that genuinely looks like a dancer's skirt. But there are also tulips named after celebrities, after political figures, after countries. There is a tulip named after Nelson Mandela, a tulip named after Princess Diana, a tulip named after Albert Einstein. The practice of naming new varieties after important figures is so well established that it is now used deliberately as a diplomatic gesture. When a new variety is named for a head of state or national hero, it is considered an honor. The Dutch, who acquired the tulip through a combination of stolen bulbs and academic enthusiasm and speculative madness, have made it entirely their own. And in doing so, they have created something that the Central Asian wildflowers' 23 million year history could never have predicted. A supply chain, a global industry, a seasonal ritual of beauty that touches the lives of hundreds of millions of people every spring. There is something worth pausing on in the story of how tulips traveled from Central Asia to the Ottoman Empire to Holland. Something about the way beautiful things move through the world and accumulate meaning as they go. When a tulip pushed up through frost-cracked soil in the Tian Shan Mountains 20,000 years ago, it was doing something purely biological: photosynthesis, reproduction, survival. The flower had no meaning. It was just alive. When Persian poets in the 10th and 11th centuries wrote about the red lale as a symbol of burning love in the ashes of the devoted heart, the tulip gained its first layer of human meaning. It became a metaphor, a vessel for emotion, a way of saying things that were otherwise difficult to say. When the Seljuks carried the tulip tradition westward into Anatolia, and Ottoman gardeners began cultivating and selecting and naming varieties, the flower gained another layer. Not just metaphor, but luxury, aesthetic achievement, spiritual significance. When Ottoman theologians noted that Lale shared its letters with Allah, the tulip became sacred, literally divine, a presence in mosques and on prayer rugs and in the decoration of a civilization's most important spaces. When Buzbek misheard its name on a spring afternoon in 1554 and wrote home about a flower shaped like a turban, the tulip began its European journey. It gained a new name, a wrong name, a beautiful linguistic accident, and became something different again: the exotic, the foreign, the thing that came from over there, from those sophisticated and slightly mysterious Ottoman gardens, from a world that was both adjacent to Europe and completely different from it. When Clusius planted bulbs in Leiden and Dutch gardeners stole them in the night, the tulip became commercial. When the tulip became commercial in a booming Dutch economy, it became speculative. When it became speculative, it became a mirror for human desire, showing in the ludicrous prices of the 1630s something true and uncomfortable about how people value things that are rare and beautiful and impossible to fully possess. The broken tulips that commanded the highest prices were sick. Their beauty was their disease. The people who loved them most were paying for something they didn't fully understand, for a kind of beauty that was, by its nature, fragile and transient. There is something almost unbearably human in that. And then after the crash, after the mania and the ruin and the lawsuits and the Dutch courts declining to enforce contracts because gambling debts don't count, the tulip became something more durable, an industry, a national symbol, a spring ritual, something that returns every year, reliable as weather, putting red and yellow and purple flowers into the world, whether anyone is paying ridiculous sums for them or not. The journey from wild mountain flower to global commodity took roughly 23 million years, which is a lot. But most of the interesting stuff happened in about 600. From the Seljuk migrations of the 11th century to the establishment of the Dutch bulb industry in the 17th century, 6 centuries of human obsession, desire, cultivation, theft, speculation, and genuine love. 6 centuries of a flower changing the people who encountered it and being changed in turn by the cultures it passed through. Historians still argue about which moment was most significant in this journey, whether the flower's real transformation happened when it moved from wild plant to palace garden, or when it crossed from Istanbul to Vienna in Buzbek's cargo, or when Clusius's garden was robbed in the night, or when the first broken tulip bloomed in the Low Countries and somebody looked at it and thought, I have never seen anything so beautiful. Each of these moments was, in its own way, a turning point. Each one added something to the flower's story. The other thing worth knowing about tulips, because we've talked so much about the European and Ottoman story that we haven't given proper attention to this, is that the tulip is still there in the mountains of Central Asia, doing what it has always done, growing wild, blooming in spring, being a flower in the original, uncomplicated, 23-million-year-old sense. Wild tulip populations survive in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan and across the mountain ranges of Central Asia, though many of them are under pressure. Agriculture has encroached on their habitats. Livestock grazing damages the populations. Climate change is shifting the conditions that wild tulips have adapted to over millions of years. Botanists studying wild tulip genetics, including the team whose work identified that 23-million-year-old common ancestor, have found that some of the most genetically unique wild tulip species are also the most vulnerable, located in small, isolated populations and mountain habitats that are difficult to study and difficult to protect. The conservation argument for wild tulips is not just sentimental. Wild tulip species carry genetic diversity that cultivated varieties have long since lost. Traits for resilience, for disease resistance, for adaptation to extreme conditions that were bred out of commercial varieties in the pursuit of beauty and yield. The breeders who created the modern commercial tulip varieties worked mostly from a narrow genetic base, selecting for specific aesthetic qualities. The wild species, including some that look nothing like the garden tulips most people know, represent an irreplaceable genetic library. If wild tulips go extinct in their mountain habitats, that library is gone, and so is whatever it might have told us about adaptation and resilience that we haven't yet thought to ask. In Iran, the tulip holds a symbolism that runs even deeper than it did in Ottoman Turkey. The red lale has been a symbol of martyrdom and sacrifice in Persian culture for centuries. The martyred Hussein, grandson of the Prophet Muhammad, is said to have caused tulips to spring from the desert sand where his blood fell at the Battle of Karbala. After the Islamic Revolution of 1979, the red tulip was adopted as a symbol of revolutionary martyrdom, appearing on Iranian banknotes and official emblems. The word Lale is among the most popular girls' names in Iran. The tulip that Busbek saw and wrote home about in 1554 was almost certainly a wild Iranian species, Tulipa armena. Vivid scarlet, lance-shaped petals, a startling dark center. That specific wildflower, or one very close to it, has been woven into Persian and Iranian cultural identity for over 1,000 years of recorded history, and presumably for much longer before that. In Afghanistan, wild tulips bloom on the plains around Mazar-e Sharif every spring, drawing crowds of people to celebrate Nowruz, the Persian New Year, which falls on the spring equinox. The word for a garden full of red tulips, lalzar, is used idiomatically in Kashmiri to refer to one's beloved. The flower is everywhere, across this entire swath of the world, carrying its layers of meaning that accumulated long before any European diplomat wrote about a flower that looked like a turban. The Dutch garden tulips, in their perfectly spaced rows, and the Istanbul tulip on the tiles of the Blue Mosque, and the wild lala on the plains of Khorasan. These are all the same flower. All of them are the same plant that has been evolving in the mountains of Central Asia for 23 million years, which has been doing what plants do, which is survive and bloom and find ways to ensure that the next generation blooms too. Everything else, the poetry, the palaces, the futures contracts, the tulip era, the mania, the crash, the billion bulbs per year, is what happened when human beings came along and decided that a flower this beautiful deserved a more complicated story. In the end, the tulip story is really about desire. Not desire in an abstract sense, but the very specific, very human desire for beauty. And the way that desire, when it encounters something genuinely beautiful, is almost incapable of being moderate about it. The nomadic people of Central Asia desired it enough to carry its bulbs on their migrations. Persian poets desired it enough to write hundreds of years of verses about its red petals and dark heart. Ottoman gardeners desired it enough to spend decades cultivating and selecting and naming 1,500 varieties, each one a small argument about what beauty ought to look like. The Ottoman court desired it enough to build a whole cultural era around it, complete with tortoise-mounted candles and midnight garden parties and poems composed on silk cushions in the lamplight. And the Dutch desired it enough to steal it, speculate on it, trade contracts for it in taverns, pay the equivalent of a canal house for a single bulb, crash their own market, and then, this is the part that gets underappreciated, get back up and build an industry instead. The Dutch response to the aftermath of Tulip Mania is actually quite interesting. The growers and traders who survived the crash didn't abandon the tulip. They cleaned up the speculation, got rid of the shady operators, established the bulb-growing region on a proper commercial footing, and kept going. They had learned the hard and expensive lesson that a market cannot sustain prices that have no relationship to genuine value. And they applied that lesson. The sandy soil between Leiden and Haarlem became the Bolin Streak. The clock auction system was developed. The industry grew slowly and steadily, and over the following centuries became the extraordinary thing it is today. Somewhere between the wild mountain flower and the flower festival in Istanbul and the canal houses of Amsterdam, the tulip became a kind of lens through which you can look at human history and see, in relatively concentrated form, a lot of the things that human beings have always done. The desire to possess beautiful things, the willingness to invest beauty with spiritual meaning, the creation of markets and the madness of those markets, the slow, patient work of cultivation, the persistence of symbolic meaning across centuries, and the simple fact available to anyone who plants a bulb in autumn and waits for spring, that something small and brown and unpromising placed in cold, dark soil will, given enough time and the right conditions, push itself upward toward the light and open into something genuinely, unreasonably beautiful. The tulip has been doing that for 23 million years. It will probably keep doing it for a while longer. That's the story of the tulip, from the Tian Shan Mountains to the gardens of the Ottoman sultans, from the stolen bulbs in Leiden to the crashing prices of 1637, from the blue tiles of the mosques of Istanbul to the spring fields of Holland that stretch in season as far as you can see. A flower that traveled, that accumulated meaning, that was loved to the point of financial ruin, and then loved again, more carefully, and which will be there in your garden or in a field somewhere, doing nothing more complicated than blooming long after all of our stories about it have faded. If you've made it this far and you're still awake, I genuinely respect you. And if you've drifted off somewhere earlier, surrounded by imaginary Ottoman garden parties and the soft light of 1,000 candles, that's exactly where I hoped tonight would take you. Before you drift all the way off, if you enjoy what I do here, a like and a subscribe genuinely means the world to me. It helps other people find these videos, which means more people getting to sleep to stories about tulip manias and stolen bulbs and sultans who named a whole era after a flower. And if you've been here before, welcome back. I'll see you in the next one. Sleep well.